The freezing morning of December 22, 1944, found German commanders in the Ardennes confronting intelligence reports that contradicted their most fundamental assumptions about American military capabilities and about the success of their own offensive operations. The Wehrmacht forces that had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein 4 days earlier, that had achieved tactical surprise and had driven American forces back in confusion, that had seemed to be replicating the triumph of 1940 through winter forests, were learning that the Americans possessed operational flexibility and speed of response that German planning had not credited to them. General George S. Patton's Third Army, which German intelligence had assessed as being committed to offensive operations in the Saar region, over 100 kilometers south of the breakthrough, was disengaging from those operations, pivoting 90 degrees northward and preparing to counterattack into the southern flank of the German salient within 48 hours of receiving orders to do so. The feat was one the German operational doctrine considered extremely difficult, even for Wehrmacht formations. Yet the Americans were executing it with speed that made German assumptions about American tactical rigidity obsolete. The strategic context of the Ardennes offensive had been shaped by Hitler's conviction that German forces could split Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a political settlement that would allow Germany to redeploy forces eastward to face the Soviet threat. The planning had assumed that American forces were predictable, cautious, slow to respond to changing circumstances, and that achieving surprise would create an extended period where Germans could exploit before Allied reserves could be concentrated for effective counterattack. The appearance of Patton's divisions attacking northward into the German flank within days of the offensive's launch demonstrated that every assumption about American operational tempo and flexibility had been wrong. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army that formed the center of the German offensive, received initial reports on December 22 that American forces were moving northward from the Saar region in strength. The reports indicated that entire divisions were disengaging from active operations, were being moved rapidly over distances that should have required days to traverse, and were being concentrated for what appeared to be a major counteroffensive against the southern shoulder of the German penetration. Manteuffel's intelligence staff assessed that the American movement represented an operational-level redeployment on a scale and at a speed that matched the best Wehrmacht maneuvers. The scope of Patton's maneuver became clearer as additional intelligence reached German headquarters through December 22 to 23. Third Army was moving not just 1 or 2 divisions, but was reorienting its entire operational axis, shifting 6 divisions initially, with more to follow. Coordinating movement of tens of thousands of vehicles over congested road networks, maintaining supply lines during the redeployment, the operation required staff work and logistical coordination of exceptional quality. It required commanders at all levels to execute complex movements while maintaining unit cohesion. It required communications discipline that prevented American intentions from being detected until movement was already underway. The comparison with German operational capabilities was sobering for commanders who understood what such redeployment required. The Wehrmacht in 1940 to 1941 had executed similar maneuvers successfully, but by 1944, German forces struggled to move divisions even short distances without fuel shortages, traffic jams, and organizational breakdowns. The Americans were accomplishing in winter conditions what German forces could barely manage in summer with shorter supply lines and less pressure from enemy air power. The performance indicated that the American military had achieved organizational maturity that closed the gap in operational competence that had favored Germany earlier in the war. The reports from German forward units engaging American reconnaissance elements approaching from the south documented the quality of forces that Patton was committing to the relief operation. The 4th Armored Division leading the advance was well equipped, aggressively led, and supported by effective artillery and airstrikes when weather permitted. The division's combat teams demonstrated tactical flexibility in bypassing strong points, in concentrating force at breakthrough points, and in maintaining momentum despite resistance. The performance suggested that American armored forces had absorbed lessons from earlier fighting and had developed doctrine and techniques comparable to German panzer operations. The tactical implications of Patton's redeployment forced immediate reassessment of German operational planning. The offensive had been designed to drive westward toward the Meuse River and then toward Antwerp, with the southern flank protected by defensive positions along the Bastogne-Ardennes axis. The appearance of American armored and infantry divisions attacking northward threatened to cut German supply lines, to isolate forward elements that had penetrated deepest into Allied positions, and to transform what had been an exploitation route into a potential pocket. The threat materialized so quickly that German forces had not completed their planned advances before having to divert strength to defend against American counterattack. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominally commanding German forces in the West, though actual control rested with Hitler, transmitted assessments to the Wolfschans emphasizing that American response to the Ardennes offensive was proceeding faster than German planning had anticipated. Rundstedt noted that Patton's forces were demonstrating mobility and coordination, suggesting thorough preparation for contingency operations, and that American logistics were supporting rapid movement despite winter weather that German planners had assumed would prevent large-scale maneuver. The Field Marshal's reports indicated concern that German forces might have overextended themselves before achieving a breakthrough that would justify the risks being taken. The information about Patton's operational approach revealed a command style and capabilities that differed significantly from German stereotypes about American generals. Patton had apparently anticipated that a German offensive might occur in the Ardennes, had prepared contingency plans for disengaging from the Saar and counterattacking northward, and had positioned his forces and organized his logistics to enable rapid redeployment. The preparation suggested that American command was capable of operational-level planning and execution that German assessments had not credited to forces whose combat experience was measured in months rather than years. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherrn von Lüttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps, tasked with capturing Bastogne and protecting the southern flank of the offensive, found his forces engaged in an entirely different battle than had been planned. Instead of bypassing Bastogne and continuing westward toward the Meuse River, Lüttwitz's corps was becoming fixed in siege operations against American airborne forces that refused to surrender despite being surrounded. The decision to contain Bastogne rather than capture it had been forced by the unexpected American determination to hold the town, and by recognition that Patton's approaching forces made lengthy siege operations impossible.
The defense of Bastogne by American forces demonstrated tactical competence and determination that German planning had not anticipated from troops who were supposedly demoralized by the surprise offensive. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, along with attached armor and artillery units, established a defensive perimeter that German attacks could not break, maintained unit cohesion despite being surrounded, and refused surrender demands with responses that suggested they expected relief and were prepared to hold until it arrived. The defense tied down German forces that were needed for exploitation and created a focal point for American counterattack. The December 26th breakthrough by elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division, which established contact with Bastogne's defenders, demonstrated exactly the operational tempo and tactical effectiveness that German commanders had been warned about but had not fully believed. The attack had begun only 4 days after Patton received orders to disengage from the Saar offensive, had covered over 100 kilometers through difficult terrain in winter conditions, had fought through German defensive positions, and had achieved a link-up that transformed the tactical situation. The feat validated American operational capabilities and invalidated German assumptions about response times. The tactical details of the relief operation revealed the sophistication of American execution. Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored Division had attacked along a narrow axis, concentrating its strength rather than dispersing across a broad front. The Combat Command had bypassed German strongpoints rather than reducing each one methodically, accepting risk to the flanks in order to maintain momentum toward Bastogne. The spearhead had coordinated with aircraft providing reconnaissance and close air support, with artillery firing preparation fires that suppressed German defensive positions, and with infantry following to secure the route being opened. The coordination demonstrated combined arms integration at a high level of effectiveness. The German forces attempting to prevent the relief of Bastogne found themselves engaged in meeting engagements for which they were poorly prepared. The Panzer and Volksgrenadier units positioned to block American advance had expected to conduct deliberate defensive operations from prepared positions, not to fight mobile battles against American armor attacking with determination and tactical skill. The German advantages in terrain and in defensive preparation were negated by American operational tempo that forced continuous reaction rather than allowing methodical defense. The meeting engagements favored the Americans, who possessed superior mobility and firepower. The psychological impact on German forces of failing to prevent the relief of Bastogne extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The siege of Bastogne had consumed significant German combat power and had become the focus of operational planning for the southern sector of the offensive. The American relief demonstrated that German forces could not achieve even limited objectives when faced with determined American resistance supported by American operational capabilities. The failure suggested that the entire Ardennes offensive was based on optimistic assumptions about American weakness that combat was disproving. General der Panzertruppen Walter Kruger, commanding L-58 Panzer Corps adjacent to the Bastogne sector, reported that American counterattacks were being conducted with aggression and coordination that exceeded defensive operations the Americans had fought earlier in the campaign. Kruger observed that American armor was being employed in concentrated thrusts rather than dispersed in infantry support, that American artillery was achieving preparation fires comparable to German standards, and that tactical air support was appearing whenever weather permitted, with effectiveness that disrupted German movements and concentrations. The observations indicated that American military effectiveness was improving through combat experience, while German capabilities were declining through attrition. The logistical achievement that sustained Patton's offensive impressed German commanders who understood the difficulties of supporting mobile operations in winter. The Americans were moving multiple divisions rapidly over road networks that were clogged with refugees and disrupted by combat, were maintaining fuel and ammunition supplies adequate for sustained offensive operations, were evacuating casualties and bringing forward replacements with efficiency that kept units at effective strength. The logistics demonstrated organizational capability and resource depth the German forces, struggling with fuel shortages and inadequate replacements, could not match. The weather that had favored the German offensive by preventing Allied air operations cleared on December 23, bringing massive Allied air support that transformed the operational environment. American and British aircraft attacked German supply columns, bombed concentrations of forces, provided close air support to ground troops, and dropped supplies to surrounded American forces at Bastogne. The air operations demonstrated Allied air superiority and showed that German assumptions about weather preventing effective use of that superiority had been a temporary advantage rather than a sustainable condition.
Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B and responsible for executing the Ardennes offensive, confronted the growing recognition that the operation had not achieved the breakthrough that would justify its continuation. Model's forces had advanced significant distances and had created a serious crisis for Allied command, but had not broken through to the Meuse River, had not captured the fuel dumps needed to sustain further advance, and had not forced collapse of American defensive coordination. The appearance of Patton's divisions counterattacking from the south meant that continuing to push westward risked encirclement rather than achieving breakthrough. The contrast between German and American operational flexibility became apparent as the battle developed through late December. German forces were constrained by Hitler's orders to continue attacking westward regardless of tactical circumstances, to hold every position once captured, and to commit reserves to sustaining failed attacks rather than to responding to emerging threats. American forces demonstrated the ability to shift between offensive and defensive operations fluidly, to redeploy forces across operational distances quickly, and to concentrate strength at decisive points while economizing elsewhere. The flexibility gave the Americans operational advantages that compensated for any remaining German superiority in tactical technique. The December 26th to 29th fighting around Bastogne, where Patton's forces attacked to expand the corridor into the town, while German forces counterattacked to cut it, demonstrated the intensity of combat and the operational stakes involved. German commanders recognized that if Americans could maintain and expand the relief corridor, the southern shoulder of the Ardennes salient would be threatened, that forces committed to the westward drive would need to be withdrawn to defend against American pressure, and that the entire offensive might collapse without achieving objectives that would justify the costs already incurred. General Hans von Obstfelder, commanding the 7th Army on the southern flank of the offensive, reported that his forces were under severe pressure from American attacks, that American advantages in artillery and air support were creating casualties his army could not replace, and that defensive lines were being penetrated despite determined resistance. Obstfelder's assessment was that his army could slow but not stop American advances, and that the only question was how long German forces could delay before being forced to withdraw to avoid encirclement.
The realization among German commanders that the Ardennes offensive had failed to achieve decisive breakthrough came gradually through late December, as evidence accumulated that could not be dismissed. The failure to capture Bastogne had created an obstacle to exploitation. The relief of Bastogne by Patton's forces had demonstrated American operational capabilities. The inability to reach the Meuse River within the time frame that planning assumed had exhausted initial momentum. The commitment of operational reserves to sustaining attacks that were not achieving objectives had left no strength for responding to American counterattacks. The weather improvement that brought Allied air power to bear had shifted the tactical balance decisively against German forces. The strategic implications of Patton's successful relief of Bastogne and subsequent offensive operations extended beyond the immediate tactical situation to fundamental questions about German capabilities and Allied strength. The Americans had demonstrated that they could respond to a German operational-level offensive with speed and effectiveness that matched Wehrmacht performance. The material superiority that Americans enjoyed in armor, artillery, air power, and logistics had been employed effectively rather than squandered through poor command. The combat effectiveness of American forces had improved through experience to the point where tactical advantages that German forces had enjoyed earlier in the war had disappeared. Hitler's response to reports about American counterattacks combined continued insistence on offensive operations with growing recognition that the Ardennes gamble had not achieved the breakthrough that would change the strategic situation. The Führer ordered that attacks toward the Meuse continue, that Bastogne be recaptured, that no ground be yielded to American pressure. The orders reflected Hitler's unwillingness to acknowledge that the offensive had failed, and that continuing it would consume forces that were desperately needed to defend against Soviet offensives being prepared in the East. The January 1945 continuation of Patton's offensive, pushing German forces back across territory they had captured in December, demonstrated that American operational tempo could be sustained beyond initial counterattacks. Patton's forces attacked consistently, maintained pressure that prevented German forces from establishing stable defensive lines, and exploited successes with armored thrusts that threatened to encircle German units. The sustained offensive contrasted with earlier American operations that had sometimes paused after achieving initial objectives, suggesting that American commanders had learned to maintain momentum and to prevent German forces from recovering from tactical defeats. General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger, whose forces faced the main weight of Patton's attacks, reported that American offensive operations were being conducted with sophistication that approached German operational standards. Brandenberger noted that Americans were concentrating overwhelming force at breakthrough points while fixing German forces elsewhere with limited attacks, were exploiting breakthroughs in depth rather than consolidating cautiously, and were coordinating armor, artillery, air power, and infantry in combined arms operations that maximized American advantages. The observations indicated that the American military had matured into a formidable force. The casualties that German forces suffered in the Ardennes offensive and in defensive fighting against Patton's counteroffensive represented losses that could not be replaced. The panzer divisions committed to the operation had been elite formations withdrawn from other sectors and reconstituted through concentration of remaining armor. The losses in equipment and experienced personnel could not be made good, leaving German forces weaker than before the offensive despite temporary tactical successes achieved in its opening days. The attrition meant that German capability to conduct future offensive operations had been consumed in a gamble that had not achieved strategic results. The prisoner interrogations that American forces conducted after the battle provided insights into German perspectives on the fighting and on their assessments of American capabilities. German officers expressed surprise at the speed of American response to the offensive, at the effectiveness of American combined arms operations, and at the superiority of American logistics and air support. The interrogations documented German recognition that American forces had improved significantly since the Normandy fighting, and that assumptions about tactical rigidity and operational slowness were outdated. The final German withdrawal from the Ardennes salient in January represented acknowledgment that the offensive had failed to achieve objectives and that continuing to hold advanced positions would result in encirclement and destruction. The withdrawal was conducted under American pressure, with German forces fighting delaying actions while retreating toward defensive positions closer to the German border. The retreat marked the end of Germany's last major offensive operation in the West and transitioned to purely defensive warfare for the remainder of the war. The moment when German generals recognized that Patton's winter offensive had defeated the Ardennes gamble cannot be identified precisely because recognition came at different times to different commanders. Manteuffel understood by late December that the offensive had lost momentum and that American counterattacks threatened the salient. Model recognized by early January that withdrawal was necessary to prevent encirclement. Hitler never fully acknowledged that the offensive had been a strategic failure, insisting until the end that the offensive had been sound and that only execution had been inadequate. But by mid-January 1945, all German commanders understood that Patton's rapid response and sustained offensive had turned what was supposed to be Germany's great counterstroke into a costly defeat that accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse in the West. The assessment of Patton's winter offensive from the German perspective concluded that American forces had demonstrated operational capabilities that German planning had not credited to them, that the speed of response and effectiveness of execution had exceeded what Wehrmacht operational staff considered achievable in winter conditions, and that American material superiority, when combined with improving tactical competence, created a military force that Germany could no longer defeat. The recognition came too late to prevent the commitment of irreplaceable forces to an offensive that failed, but it validated warnings from those German commanders who had argued that attacking in the West while Soviet forces prepared offensives in the East was a strategic mistake that Germany's deteriorating position could not afford.